Imagine unrolling a piece of parchment. Longer than you expect. A genealogy. Names written in careful script going back generations. David, Solomon. A long line of kings and farmers's and wanderers leading all the way down to a carpenter in Galilee and his children. Now imagine someone taking a pen, or a sword, or a decree, and crossing out the names, one by one, generation by generation, not erasing them, crossing them out, because crossing out means they were there and someone needed them gone. That's the story nobody taught you. The Bible names them. It actually names them. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verse 3, the people of Nazareth say, and I'm quoting directly, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joseph, and of Judah, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" 4 brothers. Named. In the text. In the canonical text. This isn't a fringe gospel or a disputed manuscript. This is Mark, the oldest gospel, and those names are right there. The official story stops here. The official story says, Jesus had brothers, yes, and then the crucifixion happened, and then the resurrection, and then Paul's letters, and then Rome, and the church, and 2,000 years of history. And somehow, the brothers just weren't part of it. They fade. They disappear. The story moves on without them. J.J. Benitez, who spent decades reading the sources the institution preferred you didn't read, he noticed the same thing I noticed. The silence isn't natural. The silence is architectural. Someone built it. There are 3 layers to this story, and the last one is the one nobody wants to say out loud. Before we go further, if this kind of investigation is what brought you here, it might be worth subscribing. The YouTube algorithm only keeps showing you the deeper layers if you signal that you want them, and the next layer in this particular story is where the names on that parchment start getting crossed out by emperors, one by one, over 300 years. Layer 1 is the part that makes people uncomfortable in church. Let me show you what actually happened to those brothers. James, the oldest. The one called James the Just or James the Righteous. In the years immediately after the crucifixion, while Paul is still writing his letters, while Peter is still alive, the historical record is remarkably consistent about who was actually running the early Christian community in Jerusalem. It wasn't Peter, it wasn't Paul, it was James. Think about what that means. The brother of Jesus, the man who grew up in the same house, who ate at the same table, who knew him as a child before any miracle, before any revelation, was the recognized head of the original community. Not an apostle chosen after the fact, not a convert on the road to Damascus, the actual family, the blood. The Jerusalem church under James operated differently from what Paul was building in the Greek-speaking world. James and his community kept the Jewish law. They observed the Torah. They understood Jesus as the fulfillment of a specifically Jewish messianic tradition, rooted in the lineage of David, grounded in the covenant. When Paul preached a Christianity without circumcision, without dietary law, open to all Gentiles, James was the one who questioned it. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul himself describes the confrontation in Antioch. He names James as the authority whose emissaries made Peter back down. The brother of Jesus had actual power over the apostles. And here is where the first layer starts to crack. If James was the leader of the original community, if the earliest church in Jerusalem was led by the actual family of Jesus, then the line of authority in early Christianity runs through blood, not through Rome. It runs through Jerusalem, not through Peter. It runs through a Jewish community that remembered Jesus as a human being, not through a Greek theological construct that had begun to make him into something else entirely. The institution that became the Catholic Church was built on Peter, on apostolic succession through Rome, on the idea that the authority Jesus gave to Peter passed through popes, not through biology. But for the first decades of Christianity, there was a competing claim, a quieter one, a more ancient one, and it was led by the actual family. That's the first layer. But wait, that's not the worst part, because in the year 62 of the Common Era, something happened that Flavius Josephus recorded. And Josephus is important here. He was a Jewish historian, not a Christian. He had no theological stake in making James a martyr or a saint. He was writing Antiquities of the Jews, a comprehensive history of the Jewish people for a Roman audience, and he mentions the death of James almost in passing, the way you mention a significant event in a legal chronicle. Josephus writes that Ananus ben Ananus, the high priest, took advantage of a gap between Roman governors, a moment when no one in authority was watching, to convene an illegal assembly and have James, the brother of Jesus who was called the Christ, condemned and stoned to death. Just like that. 62 CE. Less than 30 years after the crucifixion. The parchment gets its first line through a name. Now, I want you to pay attention to something specific in what Josephus wrote. He calls James the brother of Jesus who was called the Christ. Not his cousin, not his kinsman, not his half-brother. His adelphos, the Greek word for brother from the same womb. The secular historian, the non-Christian, the man with no theological agenda, used the same word the Gospels used, because that's what it meant, because that's what James was. Josephus also records that the execution was considered illegal even by other Jewish leaders of the time. The most devout Pharisees complained to the Roman governor. The high priest was removed from office for acting unlawfully, which tells you James wasn't a fringe figure. He was significant enough that his illegal execution was a political scandal. The first name on the parchment is crossed out. The brother is dead. But the family continues, because James had a successor. The next leader of the Jerusalem church was Simeon, or Simon, son of Clopas. And Clopas, according to the earliest church traditions, was the brother of Joseph, which makes Simeon the cousin of Jesus, another member of the royal family. Another Desposynos. The word Desposynoi, from the Greek meaning those belonging to the Lord, was the term used by the early church itself to describe the blood relatives of Jesus. Not followers, not believers. The actual family, the biological heirs of the house of David. And for the first century of Christianity, those people were still alive. They were still identifiable. They still carried the genealogy. Simeon led the Jerusalem community for decades. He survived the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the year the Romans burned the temple and scattered the Jewish population across the empire. He led the community into exile in Pella, east of the Jordan, and back again. He was still there, still leading, well into the reign of the Emperor Trajan. And then came the second crossing. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century, quotes extensively from Hegesippus, a 2nd century chronicler who had direct contact with communities that had personal memory of the original Jerusalem church. Hegesippus describes what happened to Simeon under Trajan. He was accused, and this is crucial, he was accused on 2 counts. First, being a Christian. Second, being a descendant of David. Both charges. The family and the faith. Inseparable. Not one or the other. Both. At the same time. Because for the Roman authorities, those 2 things had fused into a single threat. A man who was a Christian was a theological problem. Manageable, burnable, occasionally useful for entertainment. But a man who was a Christian and a descendant of David was something categorically different. He was a political problem. He was the walking, breathing answer to the question that Rome had been trying to make unanswerable for a century. Who has the right to speak for the movement that Jesus started? Simeon was tortured. At length, he was reportedly 120 years old, an almost certainly symbolic number in Jewish tradition, the age of Moses at his death. But what Hegesippus is communicating is that Simeon was ancient, that he was the last living connection to the original community, and that he endured torture with a composure that astonished even his accusers. And then he was crucified. Think about the specific shape of that execution. Not beheaded, not imprisoned, crucified. The same method, the same symbolism, the same deliberate erasure. Hegesippus says his accusers, including a man named Atticus, who served as the consular governor, were themselves bewildered by how a man of his age and his evident sanctity could be treated as a threat. They crucified him anyway, because it wasn't about what Simeon himself could do at 120 years old. It was about what the name meant, what the bloodline represented. What would happen if the communities he still led looked at his genealogy and decided that his authority was more legitimate than any bishop Rome had appointed? The second name goes through on the parchment. But here is where the second layer shifts into something else entirely. Because before Simeon's death, decades before, under the Emperor Domitian, around the year 95 of the Common Era, there had been a different kind of hunting. Domitian, like every Roman emperor, was obsessed with rivals. He was particularly obsessed with the idea that somewhere in the empire there might be a living heir to the line of David, a genuine royal claimant whose existence could destabilize the Pax Romana the same way the memory of a Jewish Messiah king had already proven to do. So Domitian ordered a search. And the search found them. Hegesippus, again quoted by Eusebius, describes what happened when the grandsons of Judas, another of Jesus's named brothers, were brought before Domitian in Rome. Two young men, farmers. The emperor questioned them personally about this supposed royal bloodline, about the nature of Christ's kingdom, about whether they represented a political threat. And here is the detail that has stayed with me since I first read it. I remember sitting in my study in Evansville, 3 in the morning, with the Eusebius text open in front of me, and coming across this passage and actually stopping. The grandsons of Judas showed Domitian their hands, calloused, rough, the hands of farmers who worked the land. They explained that the kingdom they believed in was not of this world. Not a political dynasty, not an army, not a throne in Rome's sense of the word. They owned a small plot of land worth about 9,000 denarii between them. They paid their taxes. They asked nothing from Rome. And Domitian looked at these two farmers, these grandsons of the brother of Jesus, these carriers of the Davidic bloodline, these men who were, by blood, closer to the origin of Christianity than anyone alive in that room. And he let them go. He dismissed them as harmless, which tells you everything about what Rome feared and what it didn't fear. Rome didn't fear poor farmers with calloused hands, even if they carried the bloodline. What Rome feared was that bloodline attached to power, attached to authority, attached to an institution that could rival Rome. That fear was going to become a prophecy. Hold on, because now we're at the third layer. And this is the one nobody is comfortable saying. Go back for a second to that opening image. The parchment with the names. The line of David going down through generations to James, to Simeon, to the grandsons of Judas. Now, think about what that parchment represented. It represented a competing authority structure. Not theological, not abstract, biological. If you were a member of the early Christian community in the first 3 centuries, you had a choice about where authority came from. You could follow the Roman model, the bishops appointed by other bishops in a line going back to Peter, the apostolic succession that the Church of Rome was building into the foundation of its power. Or you could follow the Jerusalem model, the family, the blood relatives of Jesus, the people who actually knew him, whose grandparents had sat at the same table, who carried in their very bodies the lineage that the prophets had pointed toward. Both models existed simultaneously, for generations. And as long as the Desposyni were alive, the Jerusalem model had a living heartbeat. Now here is the thing that makes this bigger than a theological dispute. In the Roman world, lineage wasn't just a family record, it was a form of governance. The Senate didn't appoint emperors purely on merit. Bloodlines mattered, adoptions mattered, the legal fiction of dynastic continuity mattered. Rome understood, at a level so fundamental it was almost unconscious, that the right to rule flows through blood as much as through appointment. That's why Julius Africano, writing in the early 3rd century, quoted by Eusebius, specifically documents that the Desposyni preserved their genealogical records. They weren't doing this for sentimental reasons. Genealogies in that world were legal instruments. They were property documents. They were titles to authority. The Desposyni were carrying a title. Rome was building its own. This is what Rome needed to stop, not just by killing them. Killing them made martyrs, and martyrs made movements, but by methodically, systematically removing the idea that blood authority even existed, by rewriting the early church's history so that apostolic succession through Rome was the only succession that ever mattered, by building a theological structure so complete, so authoritative, so institutionally massive, that by the time someone asked, "But what about the actual family of Jesus?" the question would sound almost absurd. Eusebius, who is our main source for the Desposyni's survival, was himself writing in the 4th century, exactly when Constantine had made Christianity the official religion of Rome, exactly when the Roman Church was consolidating its power into something that would last millennia. The timing of when these records were preserved, and what they were preserved to show, is not neutral. And then there is the account that Malachi Martin, a former Jesuit, a controversial figure, someone whose work is disputed and should be approached with that dispute clearly in mind, describes in his book on the decline of the Roman Church. He records what he claims was a meeting in 318 of the Common Era. A delegation of Desposyni, actual blood relatives of Jesus, still identifying as such, still maintaining their genealogies, traveled to Rome. They met with Pope Sylvester I. They had a demand. They wanted the Church of Rome to acknowledge Jerusalem as the Mother Church. They wanted Desposyni, blood relatives of Jesus, appointed as bishops in major cities. They wanted the authority of blood recognized alongside the authority of apostolic succession. Sylvester refused. I want to be precise here, because Nathan's editorial line demands precision. This account comes from Malachi Martin, who was quoting from sources that historians have not been able to independently verify in contemporary documents. It may be tradition. It may be embellishment. It is not established fact in the way the Josephus passage is established fact, but here is what is undeniable. The Desposyni existed. They were documented. They were feared by 3 emperors across 3 centuries. And at some point, between the grandsons of Judas being released by Domitian and the Council of Nicaea in 325, they ceased to matter to the institutional record. Something happened to make them disappear. Go back to that parchment one more time. All those names of the Davidic line, leading down through generations. James, Joseph, Judah, Simon, their children, their grandchildren, the grandson standing before Domitian, the last Desposyni traveling to Rome with a demand. The Bible tells you Jesus had brothers. That's where we started. And that was the convenient version, the comfortable version, the version that fits in a footnote about cousins or Joseph's children from a previous marriage, explanations invented centuries later specifically to protect a doctrine that hadn't existed when Mark wrote that verse. What the text actually tells you, what Josephus tells you, what Hegesippus tells you, what Eusebius preserves even while serving the empire that erased them, is that those brothers led an entire church, that they built a community rooted in Jewish law and the actual memory of Jesus, that their descendants were hunted by 3 different emperors over 3 centuries because an emperor in Rome understood something the institution would later pretend was never true. Blood is authority, and a bloodline is a rival. The version that got deleted wasn't a conspiracy. It was a business decision. The Church of Rome needed one source of authority: apostolic, Roman, universal. A living family of Jewish farmers from Nazareth, carrying genealogies that proved a different kind of claim, wasn't compatible with that project. They weren't erased because they were dangerous. They were erased because they were inconvenient. And inconvenient things? I learned this at a school in Indiana, around a conference table, when a document I'd prepared about suppressed family histories in early Christianity was described by the administration as questioning legitimate authority. Inconvenient things have a way of disappearing quietly, without drama, without a villain twirling a mustache. They just stop being referenced. They stop being taught. The footnote gets shorter. And then the footnote disappears entirely. I remember the exact phrase the department head used. Not, "This is wrong." Not, "Your sources are bad." He said, "This doesn't serve our students well to emphasize." Which is a very careful way of saying, "This is true, but we'd prefer you didn't." I've been thinking about that sentence for more than a decade now, because it is precisely the logic, precisely the same sentence, just written in Latin and signed with a papal seal, that explains what happened to James, to Simeon, to the grandsons of Judas, to every Desposynos whose name slowly faded from the record. Not false, just not something we'd prefer to emphasize. The grandsons of Judas showed Domitian their hands, rough, calloused, the hands of people who work the land and pay their taxes and ask nothing of empire, and empire looked at those hands and decided they were harmless. That was the last recorded moment when someone in Rome had to look the Desposyni in the eye. What the institution understood, what it took 300 years and 3 emperors to fully resolve, is that a bloodline you can dismiss as harmless is still a bloodline. And a bloodline that believes its kingdom is not of this world is still a bloodline that remembers something you would prefer they forgot. This is the phrase that I keep coming back to. Not as a conclusion, not as a verdict. Just as the thing the evidence keeps saying, no matter which document you're reading. They didn't erase the family of Jesus because they were afraid of what the family could do. They erased the family because they were afraid of what the family could remember. If this investigation opened something for you, a question that wasn't there when you started, there's a library that I've spent years building for exactly these moments. The Spinoza Forever Library, 5 volumes. Link in the description and in the pinned comment. It was built for the kind of reader who gets to the end of a video like this and needs to keep going, not to find answers, to find better questions. And now, the only place left to go is inward. You know, when I was still teaching at the school in Indiana, I used to end every semester with what I called the historian's question. I'd tell my students, history doesn't ask, what happened? History asks, who decided what got remembered? Those are completely different questions. The first one is a fact question. The second one is a power question. The story of the Desposyni is a power question. James was real. Simeon was real. The grandsons of Judas with their calloused hands were real. The delegation that traveled to Rome, whether Martin's account is verified or not, represents a real tension that the documents themselves can't fully disguise. For 3 centuries, the institutional church and the surviving family of Jesus coexisted in a world where both had legitimate claims to speak for him. And we live in the world where one of those claims won. Not because it was more true, because it was more powerful. Because it had Rome. Because it had Nicaea. Because it had the machinery of empire behind it, and the Desposyni had calloused hands and a genealogy and a memory of a man who told them his kingdom was not of this world. There's a detail in Hegesippus that I find almost unbearable in its smallness. When the grandsons of Judas were released by Domitian, they went back to the communities, back to leading the local churches in the villages of Nazara and Kochaba, back to being the quiet authorities in the places where the memory of Jesus was still personal, still recent, still carried in the cells of people who shared his blood. They went back to their farms, they went back to their lives, and Hegesippus says they led the church right up to the time of Trajan, right up to the time of Trajan, when Simeon, their relative, their leader, was crucified at an impossible age for being exactly what they all were, a descendant of David and a follower of Jesus. Both, at the same time, which for the Jerusalem church had never been a contradiction. For the Roman church, it was becoming one. There's a version of early Christianity that lost. It lost quietly. It left no cathedrals, no councils, no papal bulls, no doctrinal encyclicals. It left calloused hands and crossed-out names on a parchment, and a historian who happened to mention a stoning in a book about Jewish law, almost in passing, and a 2nd century chronicler whose words survived only because a 4th century bishop thought they were worth quoting. That version believed that to understand Jesus, you needed to understand the family, not as relics, not as saints frozen in stained glass. As people, as the actual human beings who shared his table and his childhood and, for the first decades after his death, his movement. The question isn't whether you believe the theological claims. Nathan doesn't have a stake in telling you what to believe about the resurrection, or the Trinity, or the virgin birth. That's between you and whatever you find when you sit with those questions alone. The question is this: if those brothers existed, and they did, and if they led an entire church, and they did, and if their descendants were hunted by Rome's emperors for 300 years, specifically because of their blood, and the documents say they were, then what exactly got decided, at some point in the 4th century, about which kind of authority would count? And who decided it? And what would it mean if the answer to that question changed the way you read everything else you were taught? I'm not going to answer that for you. I'll let you sit with that. Tell me in the comments, which layer hit you hardest? Was it James being replaced by Rome's story about Peter? Was it Domitian looking at those calloused hands and deciding a bloodline was harmless? Or was it the delegation that traveled to Rome in 318, real or not, with a claim that the institution found easier to refuse than to answer? Write it down, because these questions deserve more than a video. They deserve someone paying attention.